Welcome. I'm Keith Black from RIA Channel. I'm joined today by Julie Kane, the Chief Executive Officer, and Richard Rakowski, the Chief Economist for Democracy Investments. Welcome.
Thanks for having us, Keith.
So, Julie, what's the strategy behind the Democracy International Fund?
The Democracy International Fund was born out of our concern for both trends in democracy globally, as well as the passive international index funds that have been over allocating to authoritarian states over the years. Our fund, ticker symbol DMCY, unlike those products, we're also in the same basket of underlying international equities, 2,800 large cap, mid cap, in developed and emerging markets. But the difference is we're both market cap and democracy weighted. We leverage the Economist Democracy Index in our methodology in order to underweight in securities in authoritarians where the governments are corrupt and control the private sector. So we underweight countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, China, and we overweight securities in democracies, securities in countries that respect the rule of law, value civil liberties, and free and fair elections. So we overweight countries like Japan, the UK, Canada, Switzerland, Australia, Taiwan, and Sweden.
So why is that relevant now with everything going on in the world?
Well, every day, pick up the paper. There's new news. Just this morning, we're seeing new supply chain disruption. Volkswagen and Honda have had to halt their Chinese factories because of the strict measures of COVID. Toyota's also seen supply chain disruption. We're seeing protests over zero COVID in Shanghai and Beijing, and protests in Iran after the World Cup. They were actually cheering for the U.S. for losing to the U.S. So everything we're seeing going on in the world, and the shifting supply chains, we're seeing reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring. Given all of that, what a better time to think about your international exposure and supporting democracies and stop fueling the way we have been the growth of authoritarian economies.
Richard, what should investors be considering with the recent news out of China and in Russia?
Well, the news out of China today is that Jiang Zemin has died, and he was the Chinese leader who led China in the 90s after Tiananmen Square, and he led the economic resurgence. So there's concern that Xi may find his memory to be antagonistic because he represents the opposite of what Xi is doing right now, trying to suppress the protests. On top of that, the Chinese right now are talking about pivoting back towards central planning. And this is not going to be the central planning that, you think of when you think back to Soviet times. The Chinese have gotten past that sort of central planning. And what we should be expecting to see is the Chinese directing industry so that they have control over certain global industries. They've taken steps to consolidate, for instance, rare earths. They've decided that solar and wind power should be priorities. We should expect to see them making these sort of high-level strategic decisions to dominate certain industries. And while they're doing that, also seek to redirect business preferentially towards state-owned enterprises. This means that if you are a business owner and you're in China, you may not be able to buy from the provider that you want to buy from. You may have to go to a different supplier because the Chinese Communist Party says you have to. And when you're making business decisions based on the priorities of the Chinese Communist Party rather than just them being sound business practices, you're at a disadvantage. And these disadvantages are going to accumulate. And major businesses are also being required to have Chinese Communist Party members on their board. And those board members will likely be making increasing numbers of asks. Again, that's going to be sort of like a random de facto taxation. So the business environment in China is getting worse, frankly. Those sorts of randomized taxes combined with increases in cost of living essentially are burning the candle at both ends. And I think the Chinese miracle may be coming to an end.
And Richard, what about Russia?
Well, I think Putin has his hands full with the war in Ukraine. On top of that, I think he is having to make concessions internally to hold on to good people. Putin has, as a practice, actually had good staff in a lot of governmental positions and kept them in their positions for long periods of time. Uh, but for instance, his central banker, she was going to resign after the invasion of Ukraine. And I can't pronounce her name, I'm sorry, but she's considered to be one of the finest central bankers in the world. And Putin almost lost her. And so he's having to make concessions to her. There's another woman who leads the equivalent of the Senate for Russia. And this is during a period of time when the draft is intensely unpopular with mothers whose sons are going to Ukraine to die. So Putin has his hands full with literally one half of the Russian population, and women in Russia are fully enfranchised. So that's going to make his scenario very complicated. That said, I don't see the war in Ukraine ending anytime soon. And there's just not much to invest in. And even after the war ends, the sanctions may not be lifted for a very long time. So the investment environment there is pretty far down the road from being available.
So, what tends to happen to productivity and GDP growth in these more authoritarian regimes?
It depends a little bit on their practices. The Chinese seem to have managed to get a lot of productivity out of their people by locking them inside. But that's a productivity gain from just working people very hard. It's not necessarily very innovative or absorbing and developing new technologies. The innovative stuff seems to happen more in the democracies. The freedom to innovate, the freedom to fail. China's better at absorbing other people's technologies and then just working people really hard.
So when we talk about emerging markets, you might hear the BRICS acronym: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. What trends are you seeing in those markets?
It's a really interesting pivot right now. We've sanctioned Russia very aggressively, and the Russians are trying to pull in the other sanctioned countries into the BRICS. The BRICS aren't exactly a formal organization, but they're not. It's not like it's non-existent. They do have structure. They do have meetings. They even have a BRICS building, and they're trying to pull in Iran. Argentina is interested in joining. Turkey is taking a peek. Saudi Arabia, UAE. Interestingly, the Russians won't let Afghanistan in. The Russian foreign minister told them that the Taliban needs to work on diversity and inclusion. Again, going towards the idea that the Russians actually have a different perspective on things. And in fact, if you look at the Russian Federation, they actually have quite a few women in power. So it's not surprising that they were taking that position with the Afghans. But nevertheless, the BRICS are slowly evolving into an organization of authoritarians. And we're seeing a bifurcation from sort of the G7 pro-democracy world versus the authoritarian BRICS.
So what else should advisors be thinking about given this apparent new economic order?
They should be thinking about where they're sending their money and realizing that states with excessive amounts of corruption are probably not the best places to invest. You know, if someone's pulling money off the top, that's your money. You're not getting it back, right? So that is a definite concern. And as we see a world with resurgent authoritarianism, I think people should think seriously about whether they're going to invest with authoritarians or whether they can redirect their money more towards the democracies.
So Julie, do you have any last comments before we go?
Yes. So all three partners bring a lot of passion to our mission. Rick has his PhD from MIT. Our chief investment officer, who has a CFA, spent time in Venezuela, was former portfolio manager at Franklin Templeton and recruited Jenny Johnson to our advisory board. My background includes time at Charles Schwab Advisor Services, Wells Fargo, but I began my career in the Navy as a helicopter pilot and saw firsthand working overseas the state of democracy. And the trends are getting worse. And we've only touched the surface in this short interview. And what a great time with what's going on in the world. And I would encourage advisors to consider tax loss harvesting out of their current all world ex-US strategies and consider DMCY.
And it makes so much sense that a lot of clients might feel more comfortable having lesser assets allocated to those authoritarian regimes relative to a market cap weighted index. Thanks so much for joining us, Richard and Julie from Democracy Investments.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.